In the dusty railroad town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, four bachelor brothers made what they thought was the smartest decision of their lives, placing advertisements for mail-order brides in the eastern newspapers. They couldn't have known that. The four women who answered their calls were sisters bound by a secret mission, or that their arrival would uncover a decades-old injustice that would shake the very foundations of their quiet frontier community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind swept across the Colorado plains, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the distant whistle of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Michael Thompson stood on the covered porch of the family ranch house, watching the horizon with the same methodical patience he applied to everything in his life. At 32, he had spent the last 8 years managing the Thompson Ranch after their father's death, keeping his 3 younger brothers in line and the cattle operation profitable. The responsibility sat heavily on his broad shoulders, made heavier by the loneliness that seemed to grow with each passing season. Inside the house, the sounds of masculine domesticity echoed through rooms that had seen no woman's touch since their mother passed 5 years earlier. David Thompson, 29, and built like the draft horses he preferred working with, was attempting to mend a shirt with the clumsy precision of a man whose hands were better suited to rope and leather than needle and thread. His efforts were being critiqued by James Thompson, 26, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made him popular at church socials and cattle drives alike, though his romantic successes never seemed to lead to anything permanent. The youngest of the Thompson brothers, Robert, had just turned 3 and carried himself with the eager energy of a man still convinced that life held unlimited possibilities. He was the one who had first suggested the mail-order bride advertisements, having read about such arrangements in the Denver newspapers with the enthusiasm he applied to most new ideas. Bobby's optimism was infectious, though his older brothers had learned to temper their expectations when it came to his schemes. The ranch itself was a testament to hard work and careful management. 1,500 acres of prime grazing land, stretched in all directions, bordered by clear streams and protected by natural rock formations that provided shelter during the harsh Colorado winters. The main house was solid timber construction with a stone foundation, built to last by their father Jonas Thompson in the days when Cedar Falls was nothing more than a railway stop and a handful of ambitious settlers. Now the town boasted nearly 800 residents, a proper main street with wooden sidewalks, and enough commerce to support a general store, a church, a doctor's office, and even a small hotel called the Riverside Inn. It had been Pastor William Hayes who first broached the subject of the brothers' unmarried status during one of his monthly visits to the ranch. The minister was a thoughtful man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He had known the Thompson family since arriving in Cedar Falls 10 years earlier, and had watched the brothers struggle with the isolation that came with frontier life. "Your father would have wanted to see grandchildren running around this place," Pastor Hayes had said gently during his last visit, accepting the coffee that Mike offered with the automatic courtesy their mother had drilled into all her sons. "He would have wanted to see you boys settled with good women who could make this house a home again." The conversation had planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. Cedar Falls had precious few unmarried women, and those who were available seemed either too young or already spoken for by other suitors. The nearest town of any size was Colorado Springs, a full day's ride away, and even there the social opportunities were limited for men who spent most of their time working cattle and maintaining ranch operations. It was Bobby who brought up the advertisements he had seen in the Denver Post. Stories of successful marriages arranged through correspondence with Eastern women seeking new lives in the territories. The practice was becoming increasingly common as the railroad brought more settlers westward, and there were numerous accounts of happy unions formed through such arrangements. The younger Thompson brother had even managed to obtain some of the newspapers that featured matrimonial sections, spreading them across the kitchen table one evening after supper. "Look at this," he had said, pointing to a column of neatly printed advertisements. "Refined lady, age 24, seeks correspondence with respectable gentleman for purpose of matrimony. Excellent cook and seamstress, Protestant faith, no encumbrances." There must be dozens of them here. David had been skeptical, as was his nature. How do we know these women are what they claim to be? He asked, examining the advertisements with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock. Could be anyone placing these notices. Could be confidence tricksters or worse. But James had been intrigued by the possibilities. "Think about it," he said, his natural optimism warming to the idea. "These are educated women. Women who have made the choice to leave everything familiar behind for a chance at building something new. That takes courage. That takes the kind of character that would fit well with our family." Michael, as the eldest, had listened to his brothers debate the merits of the idea for several evenings before finally voicing his own thoughts. "If we are going to do this," he said slowly, "we do it properly. We are honest about who we are, what we can offer, and what we expect in return. We treat any woman who responds with the respect she deserves, and we make sure she knows exactly what kind of life she would be entering into out here." The process of composing the advertisements had taken the better part of a week. Each brother crafted his own notice, trying to present himself honestly while highlighting his best qualities. Michael wrote of his experience managing the ranch, his commitment to building a stable future, and his desire for a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. David emphasized his skill with horses and his steady nature, looking for a woman who appreciated the quiet rhythms of ranch life. James focused on his social connections in town and his optimistic outlook, seeking someone who could appreciate both the challenges and opportunities of frontier living. Bobby, with characteristic enthusiasm, wrote about his dreams of expanding the ranch operations and his belief that anything was possible with the right person by his side. The advertisements were placed in newspapers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, cities large enough to have populations of unmarried women, but far enough away to represent a genuine change of circumstances for anyone who responded. The brothers agreed to share the costs and to be completely open with each other about any correspondence they received. They also agreed that any woman who made the journey to Cedar Falls would be treated as an honored guest regardless of whether romantic attachments developed, and that return transportation would be provided if marriages did not result from the meetings. The first responses began arriving at Morrison's General Store and Post Office 3 weeks later. Helen Morrison, the postmistress, was a woman of 55 who had appointed herself the unofficial keeper of Cedar Falls social intelligence. She had watched the Thompson brothers grow from boys into men, had mourned with them at their parents' funerals, and had long despaired of seeing them settled with families of their own. When letters began arriving addressed to each of the brothers, bearing postmarks from distant eastern cities, her curiosity was barely containable. She maintained the proper discretion befitting her position, of course, but could not help noticing the quality of the stationery, the elegance of the handwriting, and the regular frequency with which additional correspondence arrived over the following weeks. Whatever the Thompson brothers had set in motion, it appeared to be proceeding with encouraging momentum. Michael's correspondent identified herself as Sarah Mitchell, writing from Boston in a clear, educated hand that spoke of proper schooling and careful upbringing. Her letters revealed a woman of 28 who had been managing her deceased father's small import business until circumstances forced its sale. She wrote thoughtfully about her desire for a life of purpose and partnership, her willingness to learn the ways of ranch living, and her belief that marriage should be based on compatibility of goals and values rather than mere romantic sentiment. Her letters were neither overly emotional nor coldly practical, striking a balance that appealed to Michael's methodical nature. David found himself corresponding with Elizabeth Hartwell from New York, a woman of 26 who described herself as quiet by nature but strong in her convictions. Her father had been a blacksmith, and she had grown up around horses and the kind of physical work that David respected. Her letters spoke of her love for animals, her skill in managing household finances, and her desire for the kind of stability that seemed impossible to find in the crowded, constantly changing environment of the city. There was a steadiness to her correspondence that matched David's own temperament. James received letters from Catherine Williams of Philadelphia, whose warmth and humor came through clearly in her written words. At 24, she had been working as a governess for a wealthy family, but yearned for a home and family of her own. Her letters were filled with observations about human nature, gentle wit, and an obvious intelligence that complemented James's own social instincts. She wrote of her involvement in her church's charitable works and her belief that life's greatest satisfactions came from building connections with others. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bobby's correspondent was Margaret Foster from Chicago, the youngest of the four at 22. Her letters vibrated with energy and ambition, describing her work in a textile factory and her dreams of contributing to something larger than herself. She wrote about her fascination with the stories she had heard about Western expansion and her conviction that the territories offered opportunities that simply did not exist in the established cities of the East. Her enthusiasm matched Bobby's own, and her letters suggested a kindred spirit ready for adventure and challenge. The correspondence continued for 2 months, with letters crossing the continent in both directions as the brothers and their potential brides learned more about each other's character, values, and expectations. The exchanges were surprisingly revealing, covering topics from religious beliefs to political opinions, from personal histories to future aspirations. By the end of November, all 4 brothers felt confident that they had found compatible partners for what they hoped would be lasting marriages. The decision to invite all 4 women to visit Cedar Falls for the Christmas season was made collectively, with the understanding that the holidays would provide a natural setting for extended courtship and mutual evaluation. The plan was for the women to stay at the Riverside Inn, with ample opportunities for chaperone meetings and social activities that would allow both parties to determine whether their written correspondence had created realistic foundations for marriage. Letters were dispatched extending formal invitations, and responses arrived within a week accepting the proposal. The women would travel together by rail, arriving in Cedar Falls on December 15th, with the understanding that any marriages that resulted would take place before the new year. Pastor Hayes agreed to perform the ceremonies, and Dr. Adams confirmed his availability to conduct the medical examinations that frontier custom dictated for both parties before marriage. The announcement of the impending arrivals created considerable excitement throughout Cedar Falls. The Thompson brothers were well regarded in the community, and their extended bachelorhood had been a source of speculation and gentle teasing. For years, the prospect of 4 Eastern ladies arriving to potentially join the town's social fabric was the most interesting development since the railroad had first reached the area. Preparations at the Thompson Ranch took on an urgency that had been absent since their mother's time. The house was thoroughly cleaned. Repairs were made to window frames and door hinges that had been ignored for months, and David even attempted to create flower beds around the front porch, though the December weather made such efforts largely symbolic. James took responsibility for coordinating with Pastor Hayes and the townspeople who wanted to organize welcoming activities, while Bobby threw himself into planning various entertainments and excursions that might showcase the area's natural beauty and economic opportunities. Michael, true to his nature, focused on the practical arrangements. He confirmed accommodations at the Riverside Inn, coordinated with Helen Morrison to ensure that the women's mail would be properly handled, during their stay and met with Dr. Adams to discuss the medical and legal requirements for the marriages. He also took the unusual step of visiting the Cedar Falls bank to arrange for emergency funds, should any of the women decide that the arrangement was not to their liking, and require assistance with return transportation. As December 15th approached, an unexpected nervousness settled over the Thompson brothers. The months of correspondence had created real emotional connections, but the prospect of translating those written relationships into physical presence and shared daily life was daunting. Each brother found himself reviewing the letters he had received, searching for clues about whether his correspondent's expectations matched the reality of life at the ranch and in Cedar Falls. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made the Colorado landscape seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The 2:30 afternoon train from Denver was scheduled to arrive precisely on time, as the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad prided itself on maintaining schedules even in winter weather. By 2 o'clock, it seemed as though half of Cedar Falls had found reasons to be near the station platform. Michael stood with his brothers, all 4 men dressed in their finest clothes and displaying varying degrees of controlled anxiety. They had agreed to let the women identify them first, as it seemed the more courteous approach, but as the train's whistle echoed across the plains, each brother found himself wondering whether they would recognize the women they had been corresponding with for months. The train pulled into the station with clouds of steam and the screech of metal on metal, disgorging the usual collection of commercial travelers, visiting relatives, and miscellaneous passengers that the weekly service typically brought to Cedar Falls. The Thompson brothers scanned the platform, looking for the 4 Eastern ladies they expected to recognize from the photographs that had been exchanged during the later stages of correspondence. What they saw instead made all 4 men pause in confusion that slowly transformed into something approaching alarm. 4 women had indeed arrived on the train, and they were clearly the mail-order brides the brothers had been expecting. But as the women gathered their luggage and looked around the platform with obvious purpose, it became unmistakably clear that they were not merely 4 strangers who happened to be arriving together. They were sisters. Not just sisters, but sisters who moved with the coordinated precision of people who had spent their entire lives reading each other's thoughts and finishing each other's sentences. The same dark hair, the same determined set to their shoulders, the same way of scanning their surroundings with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail for future reference. Even their clothing, while individually selected, showed the subtle similarities that spoke of shared upbringing and common purpose. Sarah, who had to be Sarah based on her correspondence with Michael, was indeed the natural leader she had appeared to be in her letters. She was tall and composed, with an elegance that commanded attention without seeking it. But there was something in her expression, something calculating and purposeful, that had not come through in her written words. Elizabeth, David's correspondent, stood beside her with the quiet strength that had appealed to him, but her quietness now seemed more like watchful patience than gentle temperament. Catherine, James's cheerful correspondent, maintained her warm smile, but it carried an edge that suggested careful strategy rather than simple optimism. And Margaret, Bobby's enthusiastic partner-to-be, vibrated with the same energy that had come through in her letters, but it was focused energy with a specific target. As the 4 sisters approached the 4 brothers, their movements synchronized despite the apparent spontaneity of the moment. Michael Thompson felt the first stirring of unease that would soon transform into something much more serious. These were not 4 individual women seeking new lives through marriage to strangers. These were 4 sisters executing a plan that had been months in the making. Sarah stepped forward first, her smile warm and appropriate, but somehow not reaching. Her eyes, "Michael Thompson?" she asked, extending a gloved hand with perfect propriety. "I am Sarah Bennett. I believe we have much to discuss." The use of a different surname than she had given in her correspondence was the first concrete indication that the Thompson brothers' carefully laid plans had just encountered a complication they had never anticipated. As her three sisters introduced themselves with similar warmth and similar discrepancies in their stated names, it became clear that the Christmas season in Cedar Falls was going to be far more eventful than anyone had imagined. The four women had arrived in Cedar Falls with luggage, with appropriate travel documents, and with every appearance of being exactly what they had claimed to be in their months of correspondence. But they had also arrived with secrets, with purposes that had nothing to do with marriage and domesticity, and with a shared mission that would soon turn the quiet ranching community upside down. As the introductions concluded and arrangements were made for transportation to the Riverside Inn, Pastor Hayes approached the group with his characteristic benevolent smile. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, ladies," he said warmly. "We have been looking forward to your arrival for weeks. I trust your journey was comfortable, and I hope you will find our little community to be everything you hoped for." Sarah Bennett's smile in response was perfectly gracious and completely unreadable. "I am certain we will find Cedar Falls to be exactly what we came looking for, Reverend," she replied smoothly. "In fact, I suspect we may find a great deal more than anyone expects." The words were spoken with such pleasant courtesy that their ominous undertone was apparent only to those who were listening for it. The Thompson brothers, still adjusting to the revelation that their four individual correspondents were actually four coordinated sisters, were not yet listening carefully enough to catch the warning. But Pastor Hayes, who had spent decades learning to read the subtle currents of human motivation, felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the December afternoon air. As the expanded party made its way toward the waiting wagons that would transport everyone to town, Helen Morrison watched from her post office window with the keen attention of a woman whose social instincts had been honed by years of observation. Something about the way the four sisters moved together, the way they seemed to communicate through glances and subtle gestures, struck her as worthy of very careful attention. The Thompson brothers, meanwhile, were beginning to grapple with the implications of what they had discovered. The women they had been corresponding with were real, and they had indeed come to Cedar Falls as promised. But the fundamental assumption underlying the entire mail-order bride arrangement, that they were dealing with four individuals making independent decisions about their futures, had just been revealed as completely false. As the wagons rolled toward town through the late afternoon light, carrying the four brothers and four sisters toward whatever revelations awaited them, the first act of a drama that would reshape Cedar Falls was drawing to a close. The stage had been set, the principal characters had been introduced, and the opening moves of a much larger game had been played. What would happen next would depend on just what the Bennett sisters had really come to Colorado to find, and how far they were prepared to go to find it. The Thompson brothers, despite their months of careful planning and their genuine desire for companionship and family, were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous arrangements are the ones that seem too good to be true. The December wind picked up as the wagons approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, carrying with it the promise of snow and the certainty that the quiet ranching town's peaceful winter was about to become considerably more complicated. The Riverside Inn had never hosted four guests quite like the Bennett sisters. Mrs. Clara Walsh, the proprietor, prided herself on reading her clientele within minutes of their arrival, a skill developed through 15 years of managing travelers, salesmen, and the occasional family visiting relatives in Cedar Falls. But as she watched the four women settle into their adjoining rooms with an efficiency that spoke of long practice working together, she found herself more puzzled than enlightened. They were clearly ladies of quality, that much was evident in their clothing, their speech, and their mannerisms. But there was something underneath the surface politeness, something that reminded Mrs. Walsh of her late husband's business associates when they were negotiating particularly important contracts. These women had come to Cedar Falls with purpose, and she suspected that purpose extended far beyond the matrimonial arrangements that had been the talk of the town for weeks. Sarah Bennett emerged from her room first, having changed from her travel dress into something more suitable for an evening social call. The deep blue fabric was well-tailored but not ostentatious, striking exactly the right note for a woman meeting her potential future family for the first time. But as she checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, Mrs. Walsh noticed how her eyes moved constantly, cataloging details about the inn's layout, the other guests, the sounds from the street below. Elizabeth appeared next, similarly transformed. From travel-worn to presentable, but carrying herself with the same watchful awareness that characterized her elder sister. The family resemblance was unmistakable now that they were together, not just in their physical features, but in the way they moved through space, always conscious of their surroundings, always ready to adapt to changing circumstances. Catherine joined them with a smile that seemed genuine enough, but Mrs. Walsh had spent enough years in the hospitality business to recognize when warmth was being deployed as a tool rather than expressed as genuine emotion. The third Bennett sister had the gift of making people feel immediately comfortable in her presence, but there was calculation behind the charm. Margaret completed the group, and even she, the youngest and most naturally exuberant, carried herself with the kind of focused energy that suggested specific goals rather than general enthusiasm. As the four sisters gathered in the inn's small parlor to await the Thompson brothers' evening visit, Mrs. Walsh retreated to her kitchen but positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings through the service window. The Thompson brothers arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, as arranged during the afternoon's introductions. Michael had spent the intervening hours trying to reconcile the woman he had met at the train station with the Sarah Mitchell who had written to him so thoughtfully for months. The discrepancy in surnames could be explained easily enough, but the sense that he was dealing with someone fundamentally different from his correspondent was more troubling. David appeared equally unsettled, though his natural reticence made his concerns less obvious. The Elizabeth Hartwell of the letters had seemed like a kindred spirit, someone who appreciated the quiet rhythms of ranch life and the satisfaction of working with animals. The Elizabeth Bennett who had arrived that afternoon was certainly the same person, but there were layers to her personality that had not been evident in their correspondence. James, typically, was handling the situation with more equanimity, though even his natural social confidence seemed somewhat strained. Catherine Williams had become Catherine Bennett, and while her warmth and intelligence remained apparent, there was an edge to her interactions that suggested purposes beyond the romantic connection they had been building through their letters. Bobby alone seemed relatively unaffected by the day's revelations, perhaps because his natural optimism made him more willing to see the sisters' coordinated arrival as an interesting development rather than a cause for concern. Margaret Foster was now Margaret Bennett, but she retained the energy and ambition that had attracted him in the first place. Pastor Hayes had agreed to join the evening's gathering, partly to provide appropriate chaperoning and partly because his instincts told him that the Thompson brothers might benefit from moral support. He arrived at the Riverside Inn a few minutes after the brothers, carrying himself with the calm dignity that had made him a respected figure throughout the county. The initial conversation proceeded with the careful courtesy appropriate to such circumstances. The sisters expressed appreciation for the comfortable journey, admiration for the dramatic landscape they had observed from the train, and interest in learning more about Cedar Falls and the surrounding ranching community. The brothers responded with detailed descriptions of local attractions, explanations of seasonal rhythms on the ranch, and assurances that the women would find the community welcoming. But underneath the pleasant surface conversation, tensions were building that had nothing to do with the normal awkwardness of strangers getting acquainted. Michael found himself studying Sarah's expressions, trying to reconcile her present demeanor with the voice that had emerged from months of letters. There were moments when she seemed exactly like the woman he had been corresponding with, and other moments when he felt like he was meeting someone entirely different. It was Dr. Adams who provided the opening that shifted the conversation into more serious territory. He had stopped by the inn ostensibly to welcome the visiting ladies, but actually because his curiosity had been aroused by the afternoon's introductions. As the town's only physician, he had developed considerable skill at reading people's health and emotional states, and something about the Bennett sisters struck him as worthy of closer examination. "I hope you ladies had a comfortable journey," he said, settling into one of Mrs. Walsh's better chairs. "The railroad has made such arrangements much more practical than they were even a few years ago. Have you traveled extensively by train?" Sarah answered smoothly, explaining that they had indeed made good use of the expanding rail network, but her response contained just enough specificity about routes and connections to suggest more travel experience than would be typical for women of their supposed backgrounds. Dr. Adams listened with the attention he usually reserved for patients describing symptoms, filing away details that might prove significant later. It was Catherine who moved the conversation toward more personal territory, asking about the local medical facilities and educational opportunities with the kind of informed questions that revealed considerable knowledge about frontier communities. Her inquiries were perfectly reasonable for someone contemplating relocation, but they were also the kinds of questions that someone conducting research might ask. Margaret contributed observations about the town's commercial development that demonstrated surprising familiarity with railroad economics and territorial governance. Again, her comments were appropriate to the conversation, but they suggested a level of preparation that went beyond what might be expected from someone simply considering a new home. Elizabeth remained largely quiet, but when she did speak, it was to ask practical questions about land ownership, water rights, and cattle breeding that revealed an understanding of ranching operations that had not been evident in her letters. To David, her questions were intelligent and relevant, but they also indicated research that extended beyond what their correspondence would have covered. The brothers found themselves increasingly unsettled by the growing evidence that the women they had been writing to had not been entirely forthcoming about their backgrounds and knowledge. The personalities were recognizable from the letters, but there were depths and capabilities that had remained hidden throughout months of correspondence. Pastor Hayes, meanwhile, was developing his own concerns about the situation. As a man who had spent decades counseling people through various crises and complications, he had learned to recognize when individuals were operating under significant emotional pressure. The Bennett sisters were maintaining perfect social facades, but there was an underlying tension that suggested purposes far more serious than romantic courtship. It was Michael who finally addressed the discrepancy directly, though he chose his words carefully to avoid giving offense. "I hope you will forgive my confusion," he said to Sarah, "but I believe your letters were signed with a different surname. Have I misremembered our correspondence?" Sarah's smile remained perfectly composed, but there was a brief pause that suggested careful consideration of how much to reveal. "Not misremembered at all," she replied smoothly. "I apologize for any confusion. We have been traveling under our family name for convenience and safety. 4 women traveling such distances alone found it easier to present ourselves as sisters, which we are, than to explain our various individual circumstances to every conductor and hotel clerk along the way." The explanation was reasonable enough, but it raised as many questions as it answered. If the Bennett sisters had been using false surnames in their correspondence, what else about their backgrounds might not be entirely accurate? And if they were indeed sisters, why had none of them mentioned this crucial fact during months of increasingly personal correspondence? David, characteristically direct when his suspicions were aroused, posed the next logical question. "Then, your backgrounds, your work experiences, your family situations, are these as you described in your letters?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, and for a moment, her careful composure slipped enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Our letters were honest about our characters and our desires," she said carefully. We have indeed worked in the positions we described, and we have indeed experienced the losses and disappointments we shared with you. But we have also experienced things that we did not feel it appropriate to discuss in initial correspondence. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, creating an atmosphere of unease that no amount of polite conversation could dispel. James, ever the diplomat, attempted to lighten the mood by suggesting that everyone was simply experiencing the natural awkwardness of translating written relationships into personal acquaintance. But even his social skills were not sufficient to overcome the growing sense that fundamental deceptions were being revealed. It was Margaret who finally provided the opening that would lead to more complete revelations. She had been growing, visibly restless as the evening progressed, her natural energy constrained by the requirements of polite social interaction. When Bobby asked about her work in the textile factory, her response carried an edge that had been absent from her letters. "I learned a great deal working in that factory," she said, her voice taking on an intensity that commanded attention. "I learned about the kinds of men who own such places, about the kinds of decisions they make, and about the kinds of people who suffer the consequences of those decisions. I learned that sometimes justice requires more than patience and prayer." The words were spoken with such concentrated force that everyone in the room fell silent. Pastor Hayes leaned forward slightly, his pastoral instincts recognizing the sound of deep grievance seeking expression. Dr. Adams set down his coffee cup. With unusual care, sensing that the evening's revelations were about to become more significant than anyone had anticipated, Sarah placed a restraining hand on her youngest sister's arm, but Margaret shook it off with a gesture that revealed years of suppressed anger. "No," she said firmly, looking directly at Bobby. "We came here under false pretenses, yes, but not them kind you think. We did answer your advertisements, and we were honest about wanting new lives. But we also came here looking for something specific, something that belongs to us, something that was stolen from our family 20 years ago." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. The careful social dance that had been proceeding according to established frontier courtship patterns suddenly revealed itself as the preliminary stage of something far more serious and potentially dangerous. Michael's voice, when he spoke, carried the authority that had made him the family leader for the past 8 years. "I think it would be best if you explained exactly what you mean by that," he said quietly. "And I think it would be best if you explained it completely and honestly." Sarah looked at her sisters, some silent communication passing between them in the way that only people who had shared a lifetime of secrets could manage. Then she straightened in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice carried none of the careful courtesy that had characterized the evening's conversation up to that point. "Our father was Benjamin Bennett," she said, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "He was a mining engineer who came to Colorado Territory in 1865 to evaluate silver deposits in the mountains west of here. He spent 3 years developing claims that would have made our family wealthy beyond anything we had ever imagined. Claims that were stolen from him through fraud, forgery, and eventually murder. The accusation fell into the parlor like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that seemed to touch everyone present. Pastor Hayes found himself gripping the arms of his chair, while Dr. Adams leaned back as if physically struck by the implications of what he was hearing. But it was the Thompson brothers' reaction that revealed the most about the true dimensions of what was being revealed. Michael's face went pale in a way that suggested recognition rather than simple surprise. David's hands clenched into fists, and James lost his characteristic social composure entirely, his mouth falling open in obvious dismay. Bobby alone seemed genuinely confused by the sisters' accusations, but even he could see that his older brothers were reacting to more than just unexpected revelations from their potential brides. Elizabeth continued the story in a voice that trembled with carefully controlled emotion. "Our father discovered that his claims were being systematically stolen through forged documents and bribed territorial officials. When he tried to expose the fraud, he was murdered, made to look like an accident during a mining inspection. Our mother died 6 months later, some said from grief, but we always suspected poison. The details were being delivered with the precision of people who had spent years researching and documenting every aspect of their family's tragedy. Catherine took up the narrative, her earlier warmth completely replaced by something cold and implacable. We were children then, placed in an orphanage in Denver, told that our father had died in a mining accident and left no assets to support his family. We grew up believing we were penniless orphans, working in factories and serving in other people's houses while the men who murdered our father built fortunes on the silver claims that should have been our inheritance. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion as she delivered the final piece of their story. It took us 15 years to discover the truth, 15 years of investigating, following paper trails, interviewing old-timers who remembered our father. And it took us 2 more years to track down the men responsible for destroying our family. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of Mrs. Walsh's mantel clock and the distant sound of a train whistle echoing across the Colorado plains. Pastor Hayes cleared his throat carefully, his pastoral training warring with the obvious implications of what he was hearing. "These are very serious accusations," he said gently. "If what you are saying is true, then crimes were committed that would demand justice even after 20 years. But I must ask, what does any of this have to do with the Thompson family?" It was Sarah who delivered the answer that would change everything for everyone in that small parlor at the Riverside Inn. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. She handed it to Michael with a gesture that was both formal and somehow final. "Because," she said quietly, "the man who organized the theft of our father's mining claims, who arranged for the forged documents and the bribed officials, who ultimately ordered our father's murder, was Jonas Thompson. Your father, Michael. Your father destroyed our family to build his fortune, and now we have come to collect what he stole from us." The document in Michael's hands was a mining claim filed in Benjamin Bennett's name, dated 1867, for silver deposits in the mountains west of Cedar Falls, the same mountains where Jonas Thompson had supposedly discovered the silver deposits that had provided the capital to purchase and develop the ranch that had supported the Thompson family for the past 20 years. The revelation hit the Thompson brothers with the force of a physical blow, not because they had been unaware of their father's early mining activities, but because they had been raised on stories of his prospecting skills and his good fortune in finding rich deposits that had made the ranch possible. The possibility that those discoveries had been achieved through theft and murder had never occurred to them. But even as they struggled to process the accusations against their father, other details were falling into place with horrible clarity. Jonas Thompson's reluctance to discuss his early days in Colorado, his insistence that certain business papers be kept locked away and never discussed, his occasional references to enemies who might try to cause trouble for the family if they ever learned where he had settled. Dr. Adams had taken the mining document from Michael's nerveless fingers and was examining it with the careful attention he usually reserved for medical diagnoses. The paper appeared authentic, bearing the proper territorial seals and signatures, but more importantly, it contained technical descriptions of mineral deposits that matched exactly with the areas where Jonas Thompson had claimed to have made his discoveries. Pastor Hayes was studying the Bennett sisters with the kind of attention he usually devoted to parishioners confessing serious sins. Their story had the ring of truth, but it also raised questions about their methods and their ultimate intentions. That made him deeply uneasy. "If what you are saying is accurate," he said carefully, "then terrible injustices were indeed committed against your family. But I must ask what you hope to accomplish by coming here now, 20 years later, under these circumstances." Margaret's answer came with the force of suppressed fury finally finding expression. "We want what was stolen from us," she said fiercely. "We want the value of those mining claims, the profits that our father's discoveries generated, the inheritance that should have supported us instead of leaving us to grow up as orphans in poverty and desperation." But Sarah's response revealed purposes that extended beyond simple financial restitution. "We also want justice," she said quietly. "We want the truth about what happened to our father to be known. We want the men responsible to face consequences for their actions, even if those consequences come 20 years late." Elizabeth's contribution added another layer of complexity to their mission. "We want our father's name cleared," she said, her voice steady but emotionally charged. "For 20 years, people who knew him have believed he was a careless prospector who died in an accident. We want it known that Benjamin Bennett was an honest man who was murdered for trying to protect his family's future." The Thompson brothers found themselves facing a crisis that threatened everything they had believed about their family's history and their own identities. If the Bennett sisters' accusations were true, then their comfortable ranch, their respected position in the community, their entire way of life was built on theft and murder. But the accusations also raised immediate practical questions that would have to be addressed regardless of anyone's guilt or innocence. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of responsibilities that had suddenly become almost unbearably heavy. "These are extraordinary claims," he said quietly, looking at each of the Bennett sisters in turn. "If they are true, then wrongs were committed that demand acknowledgement and restitution. But they are also claims that, if proven, would destroy not just our family's reputation, but our ability to maintain the ranch and support the people who depend on us." James found his voice next, though it carried none of its usual confidence. "How?" he asked helplessly. "How are we supposed to verify something that happened 20 years ago? How are we supposed to know what our father really did or didn't do?" David's response revealed the practical mindset that had made him invaluable in managing the ranch's daily operations. "More importantly," he said grimly, "how are we supposed to make restitution for crimes we didn't commit, using resources we may not legitimately possess?" It was Bobby who asked the question that cut to the heart of their immediate situation. "What," he said quietly, "did you plan to do if we refused to believe your story? What were you prepared to do to get what you came here for?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the Bennett sisters' response would determine whether the evening would end with negotiation or confrontation. Sarah looked at her sisters once more, then back at the Thompson brothers with an expression that revealed steel beneath the social polish. "We came prepared for any response," she said simply. "We have spent 2 years documenting every aspect of what your father did to our family. We have copies of mining records, territorial land office filings, witness statements from men who worked with our father and who remember what really happened to him." Margaret's contribution was more direct and more threatening. "We also know about the current ranch operations, about your debts to the Cedar Falls Bank, about your agreements with the railroad for cattle shipments, about every aspect of your business that could be affected by public revelations about how the Thompson fortune was really created." The words carried implications that went far beyond personal embarrassment. If the Bennett sisters made their accusations public, armed with the kind of documentation they claimed to possess, the resulting scandal could destroy not just the Thompson family's reputation, but their ability to maintain the financial relationships that kept the ranch operating. Catherine's addition to the threat was delivered with the same warm smile she had been using all evening, but its effect was chilling. "We also know that territorial law regarding mining claims includes provisions for recovering stolen assets, even decades after the original crimes. With proper legal representation, we could potentially claim ownership of the ranch itself as compensation for what was stolen from our family." The implications of that statement struck everyone in the room with the force of a physical blow. The Bennett sisters had not come to Cedar Falls seeking marriage and new lives. They had come seeking vengeance and restitution, and they had spent months preparing for every possible response to their demands. Pastor Hayes cleared his throat carefully, his role as community leader warring with his desire to avoid becoming involved in what was clearly going to become a very complicated and potentially dangerous situation. "It seems to me," he said diplomatically, "that accusations of this magnitude require more than an evening's discussion to resolve properly. Perhaps it would be wise for all parties to consider their positions carefully before making any decisions that cannot be undone." Dr. Adams nodded his agreement, though his expression suggested that he was already considering the medical and legal implications of what might be about to unfold in Cedar Falls. The territorial authorities would have to be notified if formal accusations were made, and the resulting investigation would likely attract attention that could affect the entire community. But it was Sarah Bennett who made it clear that the time for careful consideration had already passed. "We have been considering our positions for 17 years, she said firmly. "We have spent 2 years specifically planning for this moment, and 6 months executing the plan that brought us here tonight." She gestured to include her sisters in what was obviously a coordinated presentation. "We answered your advertisements because they provided us with a legitimate reason to come to Cedar Falls and establish relationships with your family. We wrote those letters because we needed to understand who you were as individuals, whether you were complicit in your father's crimes, and how you might respond when confronted with the truth about your inheritance." Elizabeth continued the explanation, with the same matter-of-fact delivery that made their preparation sound even more ominous. "We have been in correspondence with lawyers in Denver and Colorado Springs. We have copies of all relevant documents deposited with banks in multiple cities. We have arrangements in place to ensure that our story will be told even if something prevents us from telling it ourselves." The thoroughness of their planning was becoming clear, and with it the realization that the Thompson brothers were dealing with opponents who had anticipated and prepared for every possible response to their demands. These were not 4 impulsive women seeking hasty revenge, but 4 intelligent, determined individuals who had spent years developing a comprehensive strategy for achieving their goals. Margaret's final contribution to the evening's revelations carried a note of personal satisfaction that made her earlier anger more understandable. "We also wanted to see what kind of men you had become," she said, looking directly at Bobby. "We wanted to know if the sons of Jonas Thompson were capable of acknowledging the truth about their father and making amends for his crimes, or if you would prove to be as dishonest and ruthless as the man who raised you." The accusation stung Bobby visibly, and his response carried the first real anger any of the Thompson brothers had displayed since the evening's revelations had begun. "We had nothing to do with whatever our father may or may not have done 20 years ago," he said hotly. "We were children then, just like you were. How can you hold us responsible for crimes we never knew about?" But Sarah's answer revealed that the Bennett sisters' concept of justice extended far beyond individual guilt or innocence. "You benefited from those crimes," she replied calmly. "You grew up with advantages that should have belonged to us. You inherited wealth that was stolen from our father. You lived comfortable lives while we struggled in poverty and ignorance." Her voice hardened as she continued, "Whether or not you personally participated in our father's murder is irrelevant to the question of restitution. The assets that have supported your family for 20 years were obtained through fraud and violence. Justice requires that those assets be returned to their rightful owners, regardless of the innocence or guilt of their current possessors." The statement revealed a philosophy of justice that was both logically consistent and practically devastating for the Thompson brothers. Even if they were completely innocent of their father's alleged crimes, they would still be held responsible for benefiting from those crimes, and would still be expected to make full restitution to their victims. Michael's response, when it came, carried the weight of a man realizing that his entire world was about to change irrevocably. "What exactly," he asked quietly, "are you demanding from us?" Sarah Bennett reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a leather portfolio that had clearly seen considerable use over many years. The worn edges and careful repairs spoke of documents that had been studied countless times, evidence gathered piece by piece across years of patient investigation. She opened it with the deliberate precision of someone presenting a legal case that had consumed decades of preparation. "We want the ranch," she said simply, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "All 1,500 acres, the livestock, the buildings, everything your father built with money stolen from our family's mining claims. We want 20 years of accumulated profits, calculated at fair market rates for silver production during the period when those claims should have been generating income for the Bennett family. And we want public acknowledgement that Jonas Thompson was a thief and a murderer who destroyed an innocent family to advance his own interests." The demands fell into the parlor's tense atmosphere like hammer blows, each one more devastating than the last. Michael felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the full scope of what the Bennett sisters were seeking. They were not asking for financial compensation that might be negotiated or payment plans that could be arranged over time. They were demanding the complete destruction of everything the Thompson family had built over 2 decades. David's hands clenched into fists as the implications became clear. The ranch was not just their home and their livelihood. It was the foundation that supported dozens of employees, suppliers, and business relationships throughout the region. The livestock alone represented years of careful breeding and herd development that could not be easily replaced or relocated. The loss of the ranch would mean the loss of everything they had ever known or worked toward. James struggled to maintain his characteristic diplomatic composure, but his voice shook slightly as he attempted to respond to demands that seemed to leave no room for negotiation. "Surely there must be some middle ground," he said desperately. "Some way to provide compensation without destroying innocent people who had no part in whatever crimes may have been committed years ago." Bobby's reaction was more direct and more emotional. His face flushed with anger as he realized that the women he had been corresponding with, the woman he had begun to imagine building a future with, had been systematically deceiving him for months while planning to destroy his family. "You came here pretending to care about us," he said hotly. "You wrote letters full of hopes and dreams and plans for the future, all while plotting to take everything we have. How could you be so cruel?" Margaret's response revealed depths of bitterness that her earlier enthusiasm had concealed completely. "Cruel?" she repeated, her voice rising with suppressed fury. "You want to talk about cruelty? Our father was murdered by your father. Our mother died of grief and poison while we were sent to an orphanage where we worked 12 hours a day in conditions that would sicken animals. We spent our childhood wondering why God had abandoned us, never knowing that our suffering was caused by the deliberate actions of a man who wanted our inheritance for himself." Her voice cracked with emotion as years of suppressed pain found expression. "We watched other children receive letters from family, receive packages at Christmas, receive visits that reminded them they were loved and wanted somewhere in the world. We had nothing. We were told we were orphans with no family, no heritage, no hope beyond what we could create for ourselves through hard work and prayer." Elizabeth continued the indictment with the controlled precision that had characterized all her interactions with David. "While you were growing up in comfort and security, learning to read and write and manage livestock, we were working in factories where children lost fingers to machinery and died from breathing contaminated air. While you were being raised by parents who cared about your futures, we were being treated as free labor by people who saw us as nothing more than convenient sources of income." Catherine's contribution carried the warmth that had made her letters to James so appealing, but now that warmth was directed toward a different purpose entirely. "We spent 15 years believing we were cursed by God, that we had somehow deserved the poverty and hardship that defined our lives. When we finally learned the truth about our father's death, when we realized that our suffering had been deliberately caused by people who profited from our family's destruction. We made a promise to each other that justice would be done. Sarah's voice, when she resumed control of the conversation, carried an authority that made it clear she had been the driving force behind her sister's long campaign for justice. We spent 2 years learning everything we could about your family, your finances, your community relationships, your individual personalities and weaknesses. We needed to understand exactly what your father had built with our inheritance, and we needed to develop a strategy that would allow us to reclaim what belongs to us. Dr. Adams, who had been listening to the sisters' demands with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "Ladies," he said carefully, "I understand that you believe terrible injustices were committed against your family, and if your accusations are accurate, then certainly some form of restitution would be appropriate. But what you are describing would affect far more than just the Thompson brothers." He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the immediate gathering but the entire community beyond the inn's walls. The Thompson Ranch employs 23 men, full-time, and provides seasonal work for dozens more. It purchases supplies from every merchant in Cedar Falls and provides transportation income for the railroad. If the ranch were to be suddenly transferred to new ownership, especially ownership with no experience in cattle operations, the economic disruption would affect every family in the county. Pastor Hayes nodded his agreement, though his expression suggested deep reluctance to become involved in what was clearly going to become a very complicated situation. "The community impact would indeed be severe," he said quietly. "But there are also questions of legal procedure that would have to be addressed. Accusations of this magnitude cannot be resolved through private negotiations. They would require territorial investigation, formal legal proceedings, presentation of evidence to qualified authorities." His voice carried the weight of genuine concern as he continued. "Even if every accusation you have made is completely accurate, the process of proving those accusations and obtaining legal remedies could take years. During that time, the ranch would be under a cloud of suspicion that would make normal operations extremely difficult. The uncertainty alone could destroy the business relationships that keep the operation profitable." But it was Michael's response that revealed the full complexity of the situation the Bennett sisters had created. He stood slowly, his movements carrying the careful precision of a man trying to maintain control under extreme pressure. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but filled with the authority that had made him the family leader for nearly a decade. "You have clearly spent considerable time and effort planning this confrontation," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "You have anticipated our responses, prepared for our objections, and developed what you believe to be an irrefutable case for your demands. But you have also made a fundamental miscalculation about the kind of men you are dealing with." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "You seem to believe that the mere presentation of accusations against our father, regardless of their accuracy, will be sufficient to force us to surrender everything we have worked for. You appear to assume that fear of scandal or legal complications will make us willing to accept your demands without proper investigation or verification." David stood as well, his quiet strength suddenly more apparent than it had been throughout the evening's revelations. "Our father may indeed have committed the crimes you describe," he said grimly. "The evidence you claim to possess may be entirely accurate, and the injustices you suffered may demand the kind of comprehensive restitution you are seeking. But those are determinations that will be made by proper legal authorities after thorough investigation, not by private negotiations conducted under threat in a hotel parlor." James found his diplomatic instincts reasserting themselves as the immediate shock of the sisters' demands began to wear off. "We are not refusing to acknowledge that wrongs may have been committed," he said carefully. "We are not claiming that your father's death was unimportant or that your family's suffering should be ignored. But we are also not prepared to accept responsibility for crimes we did not commit or to surrender assets that have supported dozens of families for 2 decades, based solely on accusations presented without proper legal review. It was Bobby who delivered the response that revealed how completely the evening's revelations had changed his perception of the woman he had been planning to marry. "You made me believe that you cared about me," he said quietly, his earlier anger replaced by something deeper and more painful. "You wrote about building a life together, about partnership and trust and shared dreams. Was any of that real, or was it all just part of your plan to get close enough to destroy us?" Margaret's answer carried a complexity that suggested the deceptions had affected her as deeply as they had affected her targets. "Some of it was real," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I wrote about wanting something better than factory work, about hoping for a chance to build something meaningful, those feelings were genuine. When I described my dreams of contributing to something larger than myself, I meant every word." Her voice strengthened as she continued. "But those dreams were never about romance with you, Bobby Thompson. They were about justice for my family, about reclaiming what was stolen from us, about making sure that our father's memory was honored and his murderers faced consequences for their actions. Everything else, every personal feeling I might have developed, was secondary to that mission." The admission revealed the depth of the deception the sisters had practiced, but it also revealed the personal cost of their long campaign for justice. They had spent months building relationships with men they intended to destroy, creating emotional connections that would make their ultimate betrayal more devastating, but that had also clearly affected them more than they had anticipated. Sarah seemed to recognize that the conversation was reaching a point where positions would harden beyond any possibility of compromise. She stood as well, matching Michael's formal posture with her own display of determined resolve. "We did not come here expecting your willing cooperation," she said calmly. "We came here prepared to take what belongs to us by whatever means proved necessary." She gestured toward the portfolio of documents that lay open on the table between them. "Every piece of evidence we have gathered over the past 2 years has been copied and deposited with lawyers in Denver, Colorado Springs, and San Francisco. Instructions have been left regarding the publication of our story and the filing of formal legal complaints if we do not return from Cedar Falls by January 15th, or if we return under circumstances that suggest coercion or threats." Elizabeth continued the explanation with the same methodical precision she had applied to all her communications with David. "We have also taken the precaution of informing certain newspaper editors about our mission and providing them with preliminary documentation. If our demands are not met voluntarily, the story of Jonas Thompson's crimes will become public knowledge throughout Colorado Territory and beyond." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that its implications became even more chilling. The Bennett sisters had not only prepared legal challenges to the Thompson family's ownership of the ranch, they had also arranged for maximum public embarrassment and community disruption if their demands were not met immediately. Catherine's contribution revealed another layer of preparation that demonstrated just how thoroughly the sisters had anticipated every possible response to their demands. "We have also been in correspondence with territorial mining authorities and federal land office officials," she said with her characteristic warm smile that now seemed distinctly menacing. "The original mining claims that your father stole from ours were filed under federal territorial law, which includes specific provisions for recovering stolen mining assets even decades after the original crimes." Margaret finished the presentation of their prepared offensive with obvious satisfaction. "If necessary, we are prepared to claim legal ownership of this ranch as direct compensation for the value of the mining claims your father stole from ours. The silver deposits he discovered using our father's surveys and geological assessments generated enough wealth to purchase and develop everything you now consider your inheritance." The comprehensive nature of their strategy was becoming clear, and with it the realization that the Thompson brothers were facing opponents who had spent years preparing for every possible response to their demands. These were not emotional women seeking simple revenge, but intelligent, determined individuals who had developed a sophisticated legal and public relations campaign designed to achieve their goals, regardless of their target's willingness to cooperate. Dr. Adams cleared his throat nervously, his medical training making him acutely aware of the psychological pressure that was building in the small parlor. "It seems to me," he said diplomatically, "that accusations and demands of this magnitude require more careful consideration than can be provided in a single evening's discussion. Perhaps it would be wise for all parties to engage qualified legal representation before making any irreversible decisions." Pastor Hayes nodded his agreement, though his expression revealed deep concern about the community disruption that seemed increasingly inevitable. "The legal and moral questions involved are far too complex for resolution through private negotiation," he said firmly. "If crimes were indeed committed 20 years ago, then proper authorities must be involved in determining appropriate remedies. If the accusations are false or exaggerated, then the Thompson family deserves protection from unwarranted persecution." But Sarah's response made it clear that the time for careful legal consultation had already passed. "We have been consulting lawyers for 2 years," she said calmly. "We have been preparing legal documents and gathering evidence and building the case that will destroy the Thompson family's reputation and recover our stolen inheritance. The only question remaining is whether that process will be completed through negotiated settlement or through public legal proceedings." Michael's voice, when he finally responded, carried a note of finality that matched Sarah's own. "Then I suppose we have nothing further to discuss tonight," he said quietly. "You have made demands that we cannot and will not accept without proper legal review and community consultation. You have made threats that will require us to engage our own legal representation and prepare our own defense against accusations that we believe to be false or exaggerated." He looked at each of the Bennett sisters in turn, his expression revealing more sadness than anger. "You came here under false pretenses, deceived us about your identities and your purposes, and attempted to manipulate us into accepting responsibility for crimes we did not commit. You have violated every standard of honesty and courtesy that should govern relationships between civilized people." David's contribution carried the quiet strength that had made him indispensable in managing the ranch's daily operations. "We will not be intimidated into surrendering assets that support dozens of families based solely on accusations presented without proper verification," he said firmly. "We will not accept responsibility for our father's alleged crimes without compelling evidence presented through appropriate legal channels. And we will not allow our community to be disrupted by threats and demands from people who have already proven themselves to be fundamentally dishonest." James found his diplomatic instincts one final time, though his voice carried none of its earlier warmth. "We are not refusing to acknowledge that injustices may have been committed," he said carefully. "We are not claiming that your family's suffering is unimportant or that legitimate grievances should be ignored. But we are also not prepared to destroy innocent people's lives based on accusations that have not been properly investigated and verified." It was Bobby who delivered the most personal response to the evening's revelations. "You made me believe that you cared about building a life together," he said quietly, looking directly at Margaret. "You made me hope that I had found someone who could share my dreams and help me create something meaningful. Instead, you were planning to destroy everything I care about while pretending to love me." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I don't know whether your accusations against our father are accurate or not. I don't know whether crimes were committed 20 years ago that demand justice today. But I do know that the methods you have used, the deceptions you have practiced, and the threats you have made reveal character flaws that would make you unsuitable partners, regardless of your family's history or your legal claims." Margaret's response revealed the personal cost of the deceptions she and her sisters had practiced for months. "Perhaps that's true," she said softly, though her voice still carried the steel that had characterized all the sisters' presentations. Perhaps the methods we chose were morally questionable. But when legal authorities fail to provide justice, when criminals escape consequences for their actions, when victims are forgotten while their destroyers prosper, sometimes questionable, methods are the only options available. Sarah stood and began gathering the documents from her portfolio, her movements carrying the finality of someone concluding a business meeting that had not produced the desired results. "Very well," she said calmly. "We had hoped that you would prove to be men of sufficient character to acknowledge your father's crimes and make voluntary restitution for the damage he caused. Since that appears not to be the case, we will proceed with the legal and public measures we have prepared." Elizabeth's parting statement carried the quiet intensity that had made her correspondence with David so compelling. "You should understand that we are not motivated by greed or vengeance," she said firmly. "We are motivated by justice, by the need to see our father's memory honored and his murderers held accountable for their actions. We will not be discouraged by legal delays, community pressure, or personal threats." Catherine's final words carried the warmth that had made her letters to James so appealing, but that warmth was now directed toward a purpose that would bring no comfort to its recipients. "We genuinely regret that our mission will cause hardship for innocent people," she said sincerely. "But our father was innocent too, and his murder caused hardship for 4 children who deserved better than the poverty and abandonment that became our inheritance." As the Bennett sisters prepared to leave the parlor and return to their rooms, the transformation in the evening's atmosphere was complete. What had begun as an awkward but hopeful meeting between potential marriage partners had become the opening engagement of a conflict that would likely consume months or years and affect every person in Cedar Falls. The Thompson brothers remained seated as their unexpected adversaries gathered their belongings, each man grappling with revelations that had shattered their understanding of their family's history and their own identities. The women they had been prepared to marry had become enemies seeking their destruction, and the comfortable world they had built through 2 decades of hard work and careful management was suddenly under attack from forces they had never anticipated. Pastor Hayes and Dr. Adams exchanged meaningful glances as the sisters departed, both men recognizing that they had witnessed the beginning of a community crisis that would test every relationship and challenge every assumption about justice, family loyalty, and the proper resolution of historical grievances. As the parlor door closed behind the Bennett sisters, the silence that remained was heavy with the weight of accusations that could not be ignored, threats that would have to be addressed, and decisions that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The comfortable certainties that had governed life in Cedar Falls were about to be subjected to pressures that would reveal which foundations were solid and which were built on lies that could no longer be maintained. Outside the Riverside Inn, the December wind carried the promise of snow and the certainty that the approaching winter would be unlike any that Cedar Falls had ever experienced. The quiet ranching community was about to become the center of a conflict that would attract attention from throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, as the Bennett sisters' carefully planned campaign for justice collided with the Thompson brothers' determination to protect everything they held dear. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the truth about events that had occurred 20 years earlier, but also the character of everyone who would be forced to choose sides in a battle where victory might prove indistinguishable from defeat, and where justice might demand sacrifices that would destroy innocent people along with the guilty. The next 3 days passed in Cedar Falls like the calm before a devastating storm, with both sides preparing for a conflict that would reshape the community forever. The Thompson brothers found themselves thrust into a world of legal consultations and strategic planning that bore no resemblance to the straightforward challenges of ranch management they had mastered over the years. Meanwhile, the Bennett sisters maintained their residence at the Riverside Inn, with the composed determination of generals occupying territory they intended to claim permanently. Michael had dispatched urgent telegrams to Denver before dawn on December 16th, seeking the most experienced territorial lawyers available to handle what was clearly going to become the most complex legal challenge in Cedar Falls history. The responses that arrived throughout the day painted a sobering picture of the difficulties they faced. Mining claim disputes from the 1860s involved territorial law that had been superseded multiple times, witness testimony that would be difficult to verify after 2 decades, and federal jurisdiction issues that could complicate even the most straightforward defense. The telegram from Harrison and Associates, Denver's most prominent territorial law firm, was particularly disturbing. Their senior partner, Jeremiah Harrison, indicated that cases involving alleged mining claim fraud from the territorial period required extensive documentary evidence and often took years to resolve through proper legal channels. More troubling was his assessment that public accusations of the type the Bennett sisters were threatening could destroy business, relationships, and community standing long before any formal legal proceedings reached their conclusions. David spent those same 3 days conducting his own investigation into the ranch's financial position and operational dependencies. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears about the vulnerability of their situation. The ranch carried substantial debts to the Cedar Falls Bank, secured by the property itself and scheduled for refinancing in the spring. Their contracts with the railroad for cattle shipments included moral character clauses that could be invoked to cancel agreements if the Thompson family became subject to criminal investigations or public scandal. More immediately threatening was the seasonal nature of their cash flow. December and January were traditionally lean months when expenses exceeded income, with major revenues not expected until the spring cattle drives and summer horse sales. A prolonged legal battle would strain their resources precisely when they were least able to afford additional expenses or business disruptions. James had taken responsibility for managing community relations during the crisis, but his conversations with longtime friends and business associates revealed how quickly rumors and speculation were spreading throughout Cedar Falls. The story of 4 Eastern ladies arriving to marry the Thompson brothers had already been the subject of considerable local interest, and the sisters' continued residence at the Riverside Inn without any announced wedding plans was generating exactly the kind of gossip that could escalate into something far more damaging. Pastor Hayes had approached him with concerns that went beyond mere social embarrassment. Several prominent families in the congregation were expressing worry about the stability of businesses and employment that depended on the Thompson Ranch. If the legal challenges proved successful, or even if they simply created sufficient uncertainty to disrupt normal operations, the economic impact could affect every family in the county. Bobby struggled with the most personal dimensions of the crisis, finding himself unable to reconcile the Margaret Foster he had corresponded with for months with the Margaret Bennett who had revealed such calculating deception. Her letters lay scattered across his desk like evidence of his own gullibility, each page a reminder of emotions that had been manipulated for purposes he had never imagined. The worst part was discovering that some of those emotions had been genuine, that she had experienced real conflict between her mission and the feelings she had developed during their correspondence. The Bennett sisters, for their part, used those same 3 days to implement the next phase of their carefully orchestrated campaign. Sarah had meetings with territorial officials in Colorado Springs, presenting preliminary evidence and filing formal complaints that would trigger official investigations regardless of the Thompson family's cooperation or resistance. The bureaucratic machinery of territorial justice moved slowly, but once set in motion, it generated its own momentum that would be difficult to stop or redirect. Elizabeth focused on financial research, working with contacts in Denver's banking community to document the Thompson Ranch's assets, debts, and operational dependencies. Her years of factory work had included bookkeeping responsibilities that proved invaluable in analyzing the complex financial relationships that sustained the ranch's operations. What she discovered confirmed that the Thompson brothers were more vulnerable to economic pressure than their comfortable lifestyle might suggest. Catherine had been assigned the delicate task of managing public opinion in Cedar Falls itself. Her natural warmth and social intelligence made her effective at conversations with shopkeepers, hotel staff, and other community members who were curious about the visiting Eastern ladies and their apparent relationship with the Thompson family. Without making direct accusations or specific threats, she managed to plant seeds of doubt about the ranch's history and the family's character. That would grow into more serious concerns as time passed. Margaret threw herself into the legal research that would support their formal complaints, spending hours in the Territorial Records Office reviewing mining claims, land transfers, and business filings from the 1860s and 1870s. The documentary evidence she uncovered painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond their father's individual case, suggesting that Jonas Thompson had been involved in a network of illegal mining claim acquisitions that had affected multiple families throughout the region. On the evening of December 18th, the simmering tensions finally reached a point where direct confrontation became unavoidable. The catalyst was a chance encounter between Bobby Thompson and Margaret Bennett in the lobby of the Riverside Inn, where he had come to deliver a formal legal notice requiring the sisters to cease making public statements about his family pending proper judicial review of their accusations. The meeting began with the stilted courtesy appropriate to adversaries who had once been potential romantic partners, but quickly devolved into something far more emotional and revealing. Bobby found himself unable to maintain the diplomatic restraint his brothers had counseled, and his questions about Margaret's motivations became increasingly personal and accusatory. "How could you write those letters?" he demanded, his voice carrying pain that was audible throughout the inn's small lobby. "How could you describe hopes and dreams and feelings that were supposed to be real, all while planning to destroy everything I care about? Was any of it genuine, or was I just a fool being manipulated by someone who saw me as nothing more than a tool to achieve her revenge?" Margaret's response revealed the complexity of emotions she had been struggling with since arriving in Cedar Falls. Some of it was genuine, she admitted, her own voice shaking with suppressed feelings. "When I wrote about wanting something better than factory work, about hoping for partnership with someone who shared my values, those feelings were real. When I described my dreams of contributing to something larger than myself, I meant every word." But her honesty extended to admissions that made her deception even more painful. "But those dreams were never about building a life with you, Bobby Thompson," she continued, her voice hardening with renewed determination. "They were about justice for my family, about reclaiming what was stolen from us, about making sure our father's murderers faced consequences for their crimes. Everything else, every personal feeling I might have developed, was secondary to that mission." The conversation drew the attention of other guests and staff, creating exactly the kind of public scene that both families had been trying to avoid. Mrs. Walsh found herself in the uncomfortable position of managing a domestic dispute that was threatening to become something far more serious and potentially damaging to her establishment's reputation. It was Sarah Bennett who intervened to prevent the situation from escalating further, appearing in the lobby with the commanding presence that had made her the natural leader of her sister's campaign. "That's enough, Margaret," she said firmly, though her eyes never left Bobby's face. "We did not come here to justify our methods to people who have benefited from our father's murder. We came here to reclaim what belongs to us, and personal feelings cannot be allowed to interfere with that purpose." Her words carried a finality that revealed just how completely the Bennett sisters had committed themselves to their mission of revenge and restitution. Bobby realized that he was facing people who had moved far beyond the possibility of compromise or reconciliation, people who had invested too much time and emotional energy in their campaign to consider alternative approaches to addressing their grievances. The confrontation might have ended there, but the arrival of Michael Thompson and Dr. Adams shifted the dynamic in ways that neither side had anticipated. Michael had come to the inn to deliver legal documents formally challenging the sisters' right to make public accusations without proper judicial oversight. Dr. Adams had accompanied him both to provide witness to the legal proceedings and because his medical instincts suggested that the psychological pressure building in Cedar Falls was reaching dangerous levels for everyone involved. The formal presentation of legal challenges transformed what had been a personal argument between Bobby and Margaret into something that would affect all the principal parties in the dispute. Michael's voice carried the authority that had made him the family leader as he addressed Sarah directly, ignoring the other sisters and the gathering crowd of curious observers. "You are hereby notified that the Thompson family has engaged legal representation to contest your allegations and to prevent further damage to our reputation and business relationships," he said, handing her a document that bore the seal of Harrison and Associates. "You are required to cease making public statements about our family or our property, pending formal legal review of your claims. You are also advised that any attempt to interfere with our business operations will result in immediate legal action for damages and harassment." Sarah accepted the document with the same composed dignity that had characterized all her interactions since arriving in Cedar Falls, but her response made it clear that legal technicalities would not deter her from pursuing her ultimate objectives. "We are prepared for legal proceedings," she replied calmly. "In fact, we welcome the opportunity to present our evidence in formal hearings where your father's crimes can be exposed to public scrutiny." She gestured to include her sisters in what was clearly a coordinated response to the Thompson family's legal challenge. "We have spent 2 years preparing for exactly this situation, gathering evidence that will prove our accusations beyond any reasonable doubt. Your legal representatives will discover that we have documentary proof, witness testimony, and expert analysis that will establish not only your father's guilt, but also the extent of the damages that must be repaid to our family." Elizabeth stepped forward to deliver the next phase of their prepared response, her quiet intensity making her words even more threatening than Sarah's direct challenges. "We have also filed formal complaints with territorial mining authorities, federal land office officials, and banking regulators who oversee property transfers in disputed cases," she said with the precision of someone reading from a carefully prepared script. "These agencies are required by law to investigate allegations of mining claim fraud, regardless of your family's cooperation or resistance." Catherine's contribution carried the warmth that had made her letters to James so appealing, but that warmth was now directed toward purposes that offered no comfort to its recipients. "We have also been in communication with newspaper editors throughout Colorado Territory and beyond," she said with her characteristic smile. "The story of how the Thompson family fortune was built on theft and murder will become public knowledge whether you agree to negotiate a settlement or force us to pursue our claims through formal legal proceedings." Margaret finished their coordinated presentation with obvious satisfaction, her earlier emotional conflict replaced by renewed commitment to the mission that had brought the sisters to Cedar Falls. "We are not going to be discouraged by legal delays, intimidated by community pressure, or distracted by personal feelings that have no place in our pursuit of justice," she said firmly, looking directly at Bobby. "Our father deserves better than the unmarked grave where his murderers left him, and we will not rest until his death is properly avenged." The comprehensive nature of their strategy was becoming even clearer, and with it the realization that the Thompson brothers were facing opponents who had anticipated and prepared for every possible response to their demands. These were not impulsive women seeking hasty revenge, but intelligent, determined individuals who had spent years developing a sophisticated campaign designed to achieve their goals, regardless of legal obstacles or community opposition. Dr. Adams had been listening to the exchange with growing concern about the psychological pressure that was affecting everyone involved in the dispute. As Cedar Falls' only physician, he had considerable experience recognizing when community tensions were reaching levels that could result in serious consequences for individual and public health. What he was witnessing suggested that the conflict between the Thompson and Bennett families was approaching a crisis point that could have devastating effects for everyone involved. The legal challenges you are both pursuing will take months or years to resolve through proper channels, he said carefully, addressing both families with the authority that came from his professional standing in the community. During that time, the uncertainty and hostility will create enormous stress for everyone involved, stress that could result in serious health problems and community disruption that will affect innocent people who have no connection to your dispute. His words carried weight because everyone present recognized the truth of his assessment. Legal proceedings involving mining claims from the territorial period were notoriously complex and time-consuming, often taking years to reach final resolution, even when all parties cooperated fully with investigators and courts. A case involving hostile parties who were actively working to damage each other's reputations and business relationships could easily become a prolonged nightmare that would consume the resources and emotional energy of everyone involved. Pastor Hayes, who had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, felt compelled to offer the kind of moral guidance that was expected from his position in the community. If crimes were indeed committed 20 years ago, he said quietly, then justice certainly requires that appropriate remedies be pursued through proper legal channels. But justice also requires that innocent people not be harmed by disputes they did not create and cannot control. He looked directly at Sarah, recognizing her as the driving force behind her sister's campaign. The methods you are using, the threats you are making, the deceptions you have practiced, these raise serious questions about whether your true motivation is justice for your father or revenge against people who happen to inherit the results of his alleged crimes. Sarah's response revealed the depth of bitterness that had been driving her family's long campaign for restitution. Justice and revenge are not necessarily different things, she said coldly. When legal authorities fail to provide protection for innocent victims, when criminals escape consequences for their actions, when murderers prosper while their victims' families suffer in poverty and abandonment, sometimes revenge becomes the only form of justice available. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, years of suppressed anger finally finding full expression. We spent 15 years believing we were cursed by God, that we had somehow deserved the hardship and suffering that defined our lives. When we finally learned the truth about our father's death, when we realized that our suffering had been deliberately caused by people who profited from our family's destruction, we made a promise that those responsible would face consequences for their actions. Elizabeth continued the justification for their methods with the same controlled precision that had characterized all her interactions since arriving in Cedar Falls. Traditional legal remedies failed our family 20 years ago, when territorial authorities refused to investigate our father's death properly or pursue the men responsible for his murder, she said firmly. We have no reason to believe that those same authorities will provide better justice now, especially when the criminals have had decades to establish themselves as respected community members. Catherine's contribution carried the diplomatic skills that had made her correspondence with James so effective, but those skills were now being used to defend methods that most people would consider morally questionable. We regret that innocent people will be affected by our pursuit of justice, she said sincerely. But our father was innocent too, and his murder affected 4 children who deserved better than the poverty and abandonment that became our inheritance. Sometimes correcting historical injustices requires methods that seem harsh to people who have never experienced the kind of suffering we endured. Margaret's final statement revealed how completely the Bennett sisters had committed themselves to a course of action that would allow no retreat or compromise. We have spent too many years planning this mission, invested too much emotional energy in preparing for this confrontation, to be deterred by legal technicalities or community pressure, she said with finality. We will recover what was stolen from our family. We will see our father's murderers held accountable for their crimes. And we will ensure that justice is finally done, regardless of how long it takes or what methods prove necessary. The exchange left everyone present with the clear understanding that the conflict had moved beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution through negotiation or compromise. Both sides had committed themselves to positions that would require complete victory or total defeat, with no middle ground available for face-saving retreats or partial settlements. Michael's response carried the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal feelings about the dispute. You have made your intentions clear, he said quietly, looking at each of the Bennett sisters in turn. You are determined to pursue your accusations through whatever means you consider necessary, regardless of the consequences for innocent people who depend on our ranch for their livelihoods. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing with the formal dignity that had made him a respected figure throughout the region. We are equally determined to defend our family's reputation and protect the community that has supported us for 20 years. We believe your accusations are false or greatly exaggerated, and we will use every legal means available to prove that belief and prevent the destruction you are threatening. David stepped forward to deliver his own contribution to what had become a formal declaration of war between the two families. We will not be intimidated into surrendering assets that support dozens of families based solely on accusations that have not been properly verified, he said firmly. We will not accept responsibility for crimes we did not commit, and we will not allow our community to be damaged by people who have already proven themselves willing to use deception and manipulation to achieve their goals. James found his diplomatic instincts one final time, though his voice carried none of the warmth that had characterized his earlier interactions with Catherine. We are prepared to cooperate with proper legal investigations conducted by appropriate authorities, he said carefully. We are prepared to consider legitimate claims for restitution if credible evidence establishes that wrongs were indeed committed. But we will not surrender to threats, and we will not allow our family or our community to be destroyed by people pursuing personal vendettas under the guise of seeking justice. Bobby's final statement was the most personal and the most painful for everyone present. You made me believe that you could love me, he said quietly, looking directly at Margaret. You made me hope that I had found someone who could share my dreams and help me build something meaningful. Instead, you were planning to destroy everything I care about while pretending to care about me. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Though the pain remained evident, I don't know whether your accusations against our father are accurate or not. But I do know that the methods you have chosen, the deceptions you have practiced, and the threats you have made reveal characters that would make you unsuitable partners, regardless of your family's history or your legal claims. The confrontation concluded with both sides having made their positions absolutely clear and having eliminated any possibility for peaceful resolution through private negotiation. The Bennett sisters had revealed the full scope of their prepared campaign for justice and revenge, while the Thompson brothers had demonstrated their determination to defend everything they held dear against accusations they considered false or exaggerated. As the principals in the dispute separated to return to their respective preparations for the legal and public relations battle that lay ahead, the community of Cedar Falls found itself facing a crisis that would test every relationship and challenge every assumption about justice, family loyalty, and the proper resolution of historical grievances. The stage was set for a prolonged conflict that would attract attention from throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, as two families pursued incompatible visions of justice that would ultimately require the intervention of forces larger and more powerful than either side could control or manipulate. The resolution came not through the legal battles or public confrontations that both families had been preparing for, but through the intervention of someone neither side had anticipated. On the morning of December 22nd, as Cedar Falls braced for what many expected to be a prolonged and destructive conflict, a telegram arrived at the railroad station that would change everything. The message was addressed to Sarah Bennett, but its contents would affect every person involved in the dispute that had consumed the town for nearly a week. It came from Denver, bearing the letterhead of the Colorado Territorial Historical Society, and its sender was Dr. Edmund Whitmore, the territory's most respected authority on mining history and territorial-era legal documents. Mrs. Walsh delivered the telegram personally to the Bennett sisters' rooms at the Riverside Inn, her curiosity barely contained as she handed over what might prove to be a crucial piece of correspondence. Sarah read the message in silence, her composed expression revealing nothing about its contents, but Elizabeth noticed how her sister's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed whatever information the telegram contained. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. Dr. Whitmore had been conducting research for a territorial history project when he encountered references to the Bennett family's mining claims in archived territorial records. His investigation had uncovered documentary evidence that would fundamentally alter the dispute between the Bennett and Thompson families, evidence that neither side had anticipated or prepared for. According to Dr. Whitmore's research, Benjamin Bennett had indeed been murdered in 1868, but not by Jonas Thompson or anyone associated with him. The actual perpetrator had been Samuel Morrison, a territorial land office official who had been systematically stealing mining claims throughout the region with the cooperation of a Denver-based criminal organization. Morrison had killed Bennett when the mining engineer discovered the fraud and threatened to expose the entire operation to federal authorities. More significantly for the current dispute, Jonas Thompson had been one of Morrison's victims rather than his accomplice. The silver deposits that had provided the capital for the Thompson Ranch had been discovered through legitimate prospecting efforts on land that Jonas had legally purchased and properly surveyed. His mining activities had never involved any claims that belonged to the Bennett family, and he had never been in contact with Benjamin Bennett or aware of his existence. The documentary evidence Dr. Whitmore had uncovered included territorial court records from 1869, when Morrison and his associates had been arrested, tried, and convicted for their crimes. Benjamin Bennett's death had been properly investigated. His murderer had been sentenced to hang, and his stolen mining claims had been recovered by territorial authorities. The problem was that the Bennett daughters had already been placed in the Denver orphanage by that time, and no one had thought to inform them about the resolution of their father's case. Sarah read the telegram 3 times before handing it to Elizabeth, without comment. Her sister's reaction was immediate and visible, the color draining from her face as she absorbed information that contradicted everything they had believed about their family's tragedy for the past 17 years. The mission that had consumed their adult lives, the campaign for justice that had brought them to Cedar Falls, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts surrounding their father's death. Catherine and Margaret were called to Sarah's room to hear the news together, and their responses revealed the depth of commitment they had made to their quest for revenge against the wrong family. Margaret's first reaction was denial, insisting that Dr. Whitmore's research must be incomplete or inaccurate. Catherine struggled to maintain her diplomatic composure while grappling with the implications of having deceived and threatened innocent people based on false assumptions. Elizabeth's response was the most immediate and devastating. She sank into a chair as if physically struck, her careful self-control finally cracking under the weight of realizing that everything they had done since arriving in Cedar Falls had been morally and factually wrong. The Thompson brothers were not the sons of their father's murderer, and the ranch was not built on stolen wealth that belonged to the Bennett family. The telegram included an offer from Dr. Whitmore to provide complete copies of all relevant territorial records, along with his professional analysis of the documentation and his contact information for further consultation. He also mentioned that his research had uncovered information about the Bennett family's legitimate inheritance, including mining claims that had been held in territorial trust pending location of Benjamin Bennett's surviving family members. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of the commanding authority that had characterized all her previous statements about their mission. "We need to verify this information before we do anything else," she said quietly, though her tone suggested she already believed Dr. Whitmore's findings were accurate. "If what he's saying is true, then we have made a terrible mistake." The understatement was so profound that it might have been comical under different circumstances. The Bennett sisters had spent months building relationships with men they intended to destroy, had made formal accusations against innocent people, had threatened to ruin lives and livelihoods, and had set in motion legal and public relations campaigns designed to achieve comprehensive revenge against a family that had done them no harm. Margaret was the first to grasp the full implications of their error. "We have to tell them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go to the Thompson brothers and explain what we've learned. We have to apologize for the accusations we made and try to undo the damage we've caused." But Catherine's response revealed how complicated the situation had become during the week of confrontations and threats. "How do we explain that we were wrong about everything?" she asked desperately. "How do we take back accusations of theft and murder? How do we repair relationships with men we've been systematically deceiving for months?" Elizabeth's answer carried the weight of someone recognizing that some mistakes cannot be easily corrected. "We tell them the truth," she said firmly. "We show them Dr. Whitmore's telegram and provide them with copies of all the territorial records that prove their father's innocence. We admit that our investigation was incomplete and that our accusations were based on false assumptions." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing on reserves of integrity that had been obscured by years of misdirected anger. "We also accept responsibility for the damage we've caused and offer to make whatever restitution is possible for the harm we've done to their reputations and their business relationships." Sarah nodded slowly, her leadership instincts finally reasserting themselves in the face of a crisis that demanded immediate action. "We send a telegram to Dr. Whitmore today requesting complete documentation of his findings," she said with returning decisiveness. "We also request information about our father's actual inheritance and any legitimate claims we might have against the real perpetrators of the crimes committed against our family." The practical steps they needed to take were becoming clear, but the emotional and moral dimensions of their situation were far more complex. They had spent 2 years building their identities around a mission of justice and revenge that was now revealed to have been completely misdirected. They had developed genuine feelings for men they had been planning to destroy, and they had practiced deceptions that had violated every principle of honesty and decency their father had taught them. The process of crafting their response to Dr. Whitmore's revelations took most of the day, as the sisters struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of their error and develop a strategy for addressing its consequences. By evening, they had composed and sent telegrams requesting complete documentation from the Territorial Historical Society and had begun drafting the letters they would need to write to formally withdraw their accusations against the Thompson family. The decision to approach the Thompson brothers directly rather than handling the matter through intermediaries was Sarah's, though it required considerable courage given the hostility that had developed between the families. She recognized that personal accountability required face-to-face acknowledgement of their mistakes, regardless of how uncomfortable such a meeting might prove for everyone involved. The encounter took place at the Thompson Ranch on the evening of December 23rd. With the Bennett sisters arriving unannounced, but carrying copies of Dr. Whitmore's telegram and their own formal letters of apology and retraction. The Thompson brothers received them in the same parlor where they had first discussed their mail-order bride arrangements, but the atmosphere was vastly different from those earlier hopeful conversations. Michael's initial reaction to their unexpected visit was suspicion, his experiences of the past week having destroyed any inclination to trust anything the Bennett sisters might say or do. But Sarah's opening statement carried a humility and vulnerability that was completely different from her previous commanding presence. "We have learned information that changes everything about the accusations we made against your father," she said quietly, handing him Dr. Whitmore's telegram without preamble. "We were wrong about the circumstances of our father's death, wrong about your father's involvement, wrong about everything that brought us here." Michael read the telegram carefully, his expression shifting from suspicion to confusion to something approaching relief as he absorbed the implications of Dr. Whitmore's research. He passed the document to his brothers without comment, allowing each of them to process the information that vindicated their father's character and their own innocence of the crimes they had been accused of inheriting. David's reaction was immediate and visceral. Years of suppressed anxiety about his family's reputation, finally finding release in understanding that their father had been an honest man, who had built the ranch through legitimate means. James struggled with more complex emotions, relief at his family's vindication, mixed with anger at the unnecessary suffering the false accusations had caused. Bobby's response was the most personal and the most painful for Margaret to witness. He looked directly at her as he absorbed the news of their innocence, and she could see in his eyes the recognition that their entire relationship had been built on deceptions that were even more profound than he had realized. She had not only been planning to destroy his family based on false accusations, but had been carrying emotional burdens and pursuing misguided revenge that had made genuine connection impossible from the beginning. Elizabeth took responsibility for explaining the extent of their investigation and the sources of their false assumptions. "We spent 2 years researching territorial mining records and interviewing old-timers who remembered our father," she said carefully. "But our research was incomplete, and we made assumptions about your father's involvement based on circumstantial evidence that was misleading." Her voice carried genuine regret as she continued. "We also allowed our anger and grief to override our judgment about proper methods for seeking justice. Even if our accusations had been accurate, the deceptions we practiced and the threats we made were morally wrong and caused unnecessary suffering for innocent people." Catherine's contribution focused on the immediate practical consequences of their error. "We have already sent telegrams withdrawing our formal complaints to territorial authorities and banking regulators," she said quietly. "We have also written to the newspaper editors we contacted, asking them to refrain from publishing the story we provided and to disregard any information we gave them about your family." Margaret's statement was the most personal and the most difficult for her to deliver. "I want you to know that the feelings I described in my letters were real," she said to Bobby, her voice barely steady enough to be understood. "My hopes for a different kind of life, my dreams of partnership and shared purpose, those were genuine emotions, not just part of our deception." She paused, struggling to find words for the complexity of her situation. "But I also want you to understand that those feelings were secondary to what I believed was a mission of justice for my family. I thought I was pursuing a righteous cause that justified the methods we used, and I was wrong about both the cause and the methods. The apologies were genuine and heartfelt, but they could not undo the damage that had been caused by a week of false accusations, legal threats, and community disruption." The Thompson brothers found themselves in the difficult position of accepting the sisters' contrition while grappling with their own feelings of betrayal and manipulation. Michael's response carried the dignity that had made him a respected community leader. "We appreciate your honesty in bringing us this information and withdrawing your accusations," he said carefully. "We understand that you believed you were pursuing justice for genuine wrongs committed against your family, even though your assumptions about our involvement were incorrect. But David's contribution revealed the lingering anger and hurt that would make forgiveness a complicated process. You spent months building relationships with us based on complete deceptions, he said grimly. You made us believe you cared about us as individuals while planning to destroy everything we had worked for. That level of manipulation causes damage. That goes beyond simple misunderstandings about historical facts. James attempted to find middle ground that might allow for some form of reconciliation. The question now is how we move forward from here, he said diplomatically. How we repair the relationships and trust that have been damaged. How we address the community concerns that have been raised. How we find a way to coexist in Cedar Falls, despite everything that has happened. It was Pastor Hayes who provided the framework that would eventually allow both families to find peace with their situation. He had been invited to witness the sisters' apologies and retractions, and his response drew on years of experience helping people work through conflicts. That seemed irreconcilable. Forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, he said gently, addressing both families with equal attention. The Bennett sisters have acknowledged their errors and taken responsibility for the harm they caused. The Thompson brothers have been vindicated of the accusations made against them. But the relationships that were damaged will require time and mutual effort to heal, if they can be healed at all. The resolution that emerged over the following days was both practical and emotionally satisfying, though it required considerable adjustment from everyone involved. The Bennett sisters decided to remain in Cedar Falls through the end of January, using that time to assist with documenting the complete withdrawal of their accusations and helping to repair any business or community relationships that had been affected by their false claims. Dr. Whitmore's complete research revealed that the Bennett family did indeed have a legitimate inheritance from their father's mining activities, claims that had been held in territorial trust for over 20 years, pending location of his surviving family members. The value of these claims was substantial enough to provide the sisters with the financial security they had been seeking, but through legitimate means rather than revenge against innocent people. The personal relationships between the Thompson brothers and Bennett sisters evolved in directions that none of them had anticipated. The romantic connections that had developed through months of correspondence could not survive the revelations of systematic deception, but they gradually transformed into something more complex and ultimately more honest. Bobby and Margaret found that their shared experience of betrayal and forgiveness created a foundation for friendship that was more solid than romance built on false premises might have been. David and Elizabeth discovered common ground in their relief at being freed from the burdens of misdirected anger and unwarranted guilt. James and Catherine developed a mutual respect based on their shared recognition of the importance of truth in all human relationships. Michael and Sarah emerged from the crisis with understanding that their leadership responsibilities extended beyond their immediate families to include the community that had been affected by their conflict. They worked together to ensure that Cedar Falls recovered from the disruption and uncertainty that the false accusations had created. The Thompson Ranch continued its operations without the cloud of suspicion that had threatened its relationships and contracts. The Bennett sisters used their father's recovered inheritance to establish themselves as legitimate members of the Cedar Falls community, contributing to its growth and development in ways that honored Benjamin Bennett's memory through positive action rather than misdirected revenge. By the spring of 1886, the crisis that had threatened to destroy multiple families and disrupt an entire community had transformed into something that ultimately strengthened the bonds between neighbors and demonstrated the power of truth to overcome even the most deeply held misconceptions. The four Thompson brothers never did marry the four Bennett sisters, but they discovered something more valuable than romance in their shared journey toward understanding, forgiveness, and genuine community. The story of their confrontation became part of Cedar Falls folklore, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception, but as an inspiring example of how people of good character can find their way back to truth and reconciliation, even after the most serious mistakes and misunderstandings. The quiet ranching town had weathered its greatest crisis and emerged stronger, wiser, and more closely knit than ever before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.